Yeah, first, thank you so much, Jackie, for having me and the whole HashiTalks team for putting this event together. So my talk today is going to be on building and deploying applications to Kubernetes with GitLab and Waypoint. So Waypoint was a tool that was announced at HashiConf or last HashiConf. And this was a tool that I kind of also wanted to jump on pretty quickly with when they released it around the same time they announced Boundary. And Waypoint kind of stood out to me because a lot of the work that we do with customers is around the idea of building and deploying applications to Kubernetes. So I figured this would be a great time to kind of understand how this application works and get used to seeing how I can tie it into different stuff, like how I'm going to do today with GitLab pipelines, GitHub Actions, all that sort of stuff, and see how it works with tools like Kubernetes, Nomad, Google Cloud Run, and all that sort of stuff. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Jacob Mammoliti. I'm a consultant at Arctic out of Toronto, Canada. And mostly I focus on enabling a lot of customers with HashiCorp tooling, especially more recently now than ever. Mostly focused on doing a lot of Vault and console work. But a lot of times those projects also involve doing some Terraform work as well. So it's usually a combination of all three. And a lot of times I also spend working with customers on all things Kubernetes. Arctic is a Google Cloud partner, so we spend a lot of time working with customers to enable them with Google Anthos. And a lot of times these tools kind of all gel together where when a customer is looking to deploy Kubernetes, they still need some solutions for secrets management, service discovery, and kind of automating the whole infrastructure builds, so we can kind of get to leverage Terraform, Vault, and console, and hopefully Waypoint in the future. So I get to work with multiple tools. My handle for Twitter and GitHub is Arctic Jacob. I am going to post the code that I'm using today eventually in GitHub as well. Right now it's sitting in GitLab just because my demo is on GitLab pipelines, but I want to eventually kind of get to work with GitHub Actions too. So I'll port over the code eventually as well. So before we get started, I kind of want to level set on the whole concept of the application lifecycle. And what we're really talking about here is how does an application go from source code that's written by developers into production, right? Or to deploy it on some sort of tool like Kubernetes or Nomad or something like that. So usually what it starts with is something like writing and testing the source code. So it's the first two circles we see at the top. And this is something that we see very common, just being working at Arctic and dealing with a lot of customers. This is usually what we're kind of seeing. So it's starting off, like I said, with writing and testing the source code. And some of that might be automated around the testing. So they might have some CI tool already in place to automate the testing, that as soon as they commit their code to a repository like GitLab or GitHub, some CI is already going to be triggered automatically to start that testing process. But then we start to move to the next few steps, and this is where stuff can kind of start to sprawl and maybe be a bit different depending on the environment or even the business unit in the organization. And it's when we start talking about the idea of building, deploying, and releasing. So when we talk about building the artifact, what we're talking about is how can I get the source code that a developer just wrote and turn it into some sort of runnable artifact. And that means a few things. So first, I need to get the source code, and for this example, we'll just assume that we want to turn it into a Docker image, right? So one of the things we have to do is something like a Docker build, and then we have to tag that image, specifying the release version, right? So if we've already released version 1 and we're working on code for version 2, we'll go ahead and write that, test that source code, and once we're ready, we can do a build and tag of that image. And then the last thing is part of the building process is likely pushing it to some sort of registry, right? And that could be so that way some sort of Kubernetes cluster is able to actually pull that image publicly or pull it in the organization. So that way, when a developer pushes it, it could be something like I said, like GitHub, like GitLab registry, Artifactory, or something like that. The third step is actually deploying the artifact, right? And that is the concept of deploying it in some sort of container runtime. So like I said, Kubernetes, Nomad, Google Cloud Run, all those sort of tools they're meant that once we have the application built and ready to go, we need to deploy it so that way we can get our clients using the application. And this is where it starts to get a bit difficult sometimes, where if we have multiple Kubernetes clusters, or if we have Kubernetes and Google Cloud Run, a lot of times where it becomes difficult for developers is, where am I deploying, right? I need to know the network location of where GKE or my GKE cluster is, or something like that. So we'll talk about in the next few slides how we can look to kind of abstract some of that stuff with Waypoint. The last piece is releasing it to, the fourth point is releasing it to the world. And this is around how do I take my application and actually expose it to everybody? So it's kind of like deploying, but the difference here is, let's take the example again that we have version 1 that's out to the world. Everyone's using our application, they're happy with it, and now we want to release version 2. Typically what we're going to do is we're not going to have 100% of that traffic going to version 2 of the application. Right? We want to start off small, maybe start around 10%, get some users on that, get some real workload and monitor and test that to make sure it's okay. And then we can start to slowly add more users. So we get like the 10 to 50 to 80%, 100%, whatever the cadence is, just to get users to version 2 of the application. That way it's kind of easy to roll back if we need to. So it's using the concept of like a blue, green, or like a canary deployment. And then the last piece is monitoring the application, right? So it's once it's released to the world, there's going to be constant monitoring, and that's usually something on the operations team is going to make sure that the application is behaving as it's supposed to. Users aren't really seeing any issues, so on and so forth. And it's just overall doing like a sort of health check and sanity check of the application. And then the process repeats, right? An application is never really done, right? There's always new features we can add to it. There's always going to be bugs that will be found, so we're going to have to patch the application. But the concept is that the app is never really done, right? We can always add more to it. So that's why it's kind of like an application lifecycle that we're constantly writing and testing our code, building, deploying, releasing it, and monitoring that application. So the next thing I want to talk about before we get into where Waypoint fits into all of this is I want to talk about kind of the manual approach and what some users might be actually seeing like on a day-to-day basis, and kind of where the starting point is when you're looking to actually write some code and get it to an end state of being deployed somewhere. So when a developer is writing code, right, and they're all ready, they're happy, they've done their tests, they're good to go. They need to do something, like I said, like a Docker build. And this is to get that into some sort of runnable artifact where something like Kubernetes or Nomad or Google Cloud Run can actually deploy, right? So this is the concept where a developer is going to have to understand and know how to use the Docker build and tag the image properly. The next thing is around a Docker push, right? So now that the image is built locally on the developer's laptop, they actually have to push it to some sort of registry, whether it's internal in the organization with something like Artifactory or Google Cloud Registry, or something public like Docker Hub. We need to push that image somewhere. And again, that could be something on the developer that they have to realize, that they have to know and be cautious of, where if I am pushing this image to maybe a deployment or a development Artifactory, I need to push it here, as opposed to if it's a production image, I need to push it to a different registry, right? So these are all little things that start to add up that could fall on the developer for them to have to know. And then the last piece here is around actually applying, right? And the reason why I kind of separate it out here is because in the event that some organization has multiple Kubernetes clusters, or has the concept of Kubernetes and Cloud Run, or Nomad and Cloud Run, or Nomad and Kubernetes, again, these are completely different tools, so different commands to get these applications deployed from a Docker image or any image to one of these environments. And again, this is something that we have to take a look at if we're deploying to dev. What does that kubectl apply look like, right? Do I have the right kube config? And same thing if I'm deploying to Nomad or Google Cloud Run, is do I have the right permissions, and do I have the right network location of where I'm going to push this application to? So Some of these processes can really slow down how often developers are able to kind of write code, test it, and get it out the door. So we're looking for some sort of tool that can maybe potentially kind of abstract a lot of this, where developers now can just solely focus on writing their code and get it deployed within a matter of minutes. And then they're given back just like a single URL if it's like a web application or something, right? They just want to be able to prove out, hey, I was able to deploy this on a Kubernetes cluster. And here's the URL to go check it out, and maybe get some actual users to test it running on that, running on something like Kubernetes. So deploying with Waypoint, and this is where Waypoint comes in when I was talking about that whole abstraction layer, right? Kubernetes Waypoint isn't coming in to try to maybe intercept or shove itself in that lifecycle that we were talking about. Its whole idea is to try to make that developer experience a lot easier by abstracting a lot of the details that they really don't need to care about. They just need to be able to have a tool that can sit alongside their application, so that when they go ahead and are ready to push their code and get it deployed, they can run something as simple as a waypoint up, which is what we have in the terminal here. And the idea with a waypoint up is that it uses an HCL manifest file to define everything from, here's how you're going to build the application. If you're going to use Docker to build it, if you're going to use something like build packs, here's how you're going to tag that image, and here's where you're going to go push it. Alongside with deploying and releasing that application, right? So it doesn't matter if the application is being deployed in something like Kubernetes or Nomad. Waypoint is going to abstract all that from the developer. All we have to worry about is just running a waypoint up, and everything is going to be abstracted from them. And it's the same thing with releasing. Again, all of that is abstracted. So when we flip over to the demo, I'll show the example of the waypoint manifest file that we're going to use. And then we can see at the end, right? Part of the big thing with Waypoint is that it can print out that URL of where it's deployed. So again, when we actually run through this with GitLab, we can see all this in action. The last slide I want to talk about here is kind of how all of this ties in with the GitLab CI/CD pipelines, right? So we've gone to a point now if we're leveraging Waypoint to go ahead and do everything for us. We've kind of abstracted the concept of the developer no longer needs to know how they're going to build the application. We've abstracted where they're going to deploy it and how they're going to release it. But we saw that they still have to technically run the Waypoint up command, right? So we can try and take this one step further, where how can we now wrap everything in sort of a CI/CD pipeline to now say, as soon as the developer pushes to a specific branch, the pipeline is going to trigger the Waypoint command to go ahead and go do that build, deploy, and release. So I've seen a lot of workflows right now too, where a lot of people already have this in place with pipelines, where they're going to actually use the native Docker commands, right? So they would do a standard Docker build tag and then push, right? And then they can have like something like kubectl apply in their pipeline, right? A lot of that stuff can be done. But again, it might be something on the developer, or you're exposing more commands into the pipeline where you can leverage something like Waypoint, like I said, to kind of abstract all that. So it's kind of defined in that manifest, in that repository of, here's exactly where I'm deploying, here's exactly how I'm building, and here's how the application is going to be released in that cluster. So this can drastically speed everything up because, like we'll see in the demo, I'm able to, as soon as I'm done writing my code, as soon as I push it, the pipeline is going to start within a few minutes. So we're able to release it pretty quickly. And the diagram I have here, the concept would be, if a developer is ready to test out a new application, or a new feature of an application, they can branch out, make their code changes, and push to that branch. And that branch can listen and can have a pipeline listening that once it's ready to go, is go ahead and actually deploy it so the developer can test their new features in a cluster that's completely isolated from production and everything else. And once they're happy with it, once it's all good, we can go ahead and do like a pull request and then merge that back into the main branch, and then eventually get that deployed to production. So we'll see in the workflow next that a lot of this can be done within minutes. That whole concept of updating the code and having it deployed into a Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so with that, I'm going to flip over now to the actual demo itself. So what we're going to start with is I'm going to go through the GitLab repository that I have set up. This is a public repository too, so I believe everyone should be able to see it. I can post the link in the YouTube chat after as well. But we'll go through this. So this is the repository that's, like I said, is housing everything from the pipeline file to the actual application itself, as well as the Waypoint HCL file. So let's go through the GitLab CI file first. And in here, what we're doing is we're defining what we want to happen every time something is pushed to this repository, or every time something is pushed to this branch specifically. So what's happening is we're creating a workflow that's just called Waypoint. We're specifying an image to use, which is just a Waypoint image that has the Waypoint binary in it already. We're starting up the Docker and Docker service. This is needed right now to build the actual application. And then we're specifying some variables in here. And this is so that way we can connect to our Waypoint server, which is living in a GKE Kubernetes in a GKE cluster. And then here is from line 13 to 19 is kind of where everything is happening, like where the engine is, because we're actually running these commands here, right? So we're just adding the Git package, and then we're doing a Docker login to our GitLab registry. That's where we're pushing the image, so that way our GKE cluster has somewhere to pull it in from. And then finally, we're just doing the Waypoint commands that we need. So we're doing an init to get everything set up, to get the Waypoint manifest validated. And then we're doing the concept of the build, deploy, and release. So in the slides, I was talking about the concept of just doing a Waypoint up. You can also do, if you really want to break it down, you could just do a Waypoint build, deploy, and release. And it'll just actually break up the steps, where Waypoint up kind of just merges them all together. So it could be perfectly valid just to switch this to say Waypoint up instead and remove 2 steps. But I just kind of want to break it out for the demo. So going back over to the main repository, I want to actually look at the Waypoint HCL file. Because we talked about this, and this is, like I said, this is where Waypoint is going to go ahead and say, I see you sent over this. I see you reaching out to me. Let me know what I need to do. And this is what the Waypoint HCL file does for us. So we're creating a project called random app. And then we're actually creating our application called random. And I'll go through the application in a second, what it actually does. And then we're going to do our concept of build, right? So we're going to use our build packs to build the application. It's just a Flask Python application that we're going to be building. The next step is pushing it to the registry, right? So we're leveraging Docker to go ahead and push the image to our GitLab registry right here. We're tagging the image with the Git reference. And this can be modified, right? If you wanted to push out and tag it as version 2, version 3, or whatever the case may be. But for here, we're just using the Git reference. Finally, we're just saying the local is false because we want to push it to a remote repository. The next step is deploying, right? And now this is in the concept of where do I want to deploy this application to? And this is where Waypoint, I think, starts to get really interesting, because we could have easily just, if we wanted to deploy to like Nomad or something, we could easily just swap out Kubernetes for Nomad. And as long as we have the right credentials, and specifically the container that's running the pipeline has the right credentials, we could easily deploy to multiple endpoints without really changing much, really just changing a few lines here. So this repository does have a designated service account in my Kubernetes cluster that has the RBAC permissions to actually deploy applications in it. We're specifying the service port here, just that my application is listening on port 8080. And then finally, we're releasing it, right? And really what we're just doing here for Kubernetes is when we deploy the application, it's going to get a Kubernetes service attached to it. And by default, that's just a cluster IP. So we're going to flip on the load balancer to true. So that way, the service actually gets a load balancer type service. So that way it gets a public IP address so that we can reach it from outside of the cluster. So that's basically it with the Waypoint file. Like I said, it's really straightforward. I remember when I was first going through this like a couple months ago, I was actually really surprised that I only needed about just under 30 lines of code to get this all set up and ready to go with Waypoint. So regarding the actual application itself, like I said, it's just a Python web application. And what it's doing is every time that we request the page, it's going to give us a new HashiCorp product. So I kind of just created like a Python list here that's really just supposed to like mimic that data if I pull from a database. I want to keep like the dependencies really small. So it's just a small application that, like I said, every time I hit it, it's going to give me a new application. So we'll see it running in action right now, actually. So let's go ahead, and what we'll do is I'm going to run everything through the web UI just so I don't have to flip through windows and everything. And I know that the GitLab UI looks a lot better. So for a demo, so I'll go over to the source, and what we'll do is I'm just going to trigger an initial build. So what I can do is I'll just change the background color, or I'll keep it as white, but I'll just take away a few zeros. Commit. So I'm going to commit to the master branch. I'm going to say update background. We're going to go ahead and commit this. And what that's going to go do now is that's actually going to go trigger our CI/CD pipeline to get started. So if I come over here, I can click the running tab. You can see it's already started. And now this is going to start running that pipeline, right? So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to pull up, it's going to install everything it needs in that container. And then it's going to start running the stuff like Waypoint init, the Waypoint build, deploy, and then release. So what we'll let's do is we'll let this kick off. I found this takes about usually 3 to 4 minutes. Once it gets past this part, it starts showing some useful information. And like I said, what I'll do too is I'll flip over to the I have the Waypoint UI here as well, and I'll kind of show you how we can view logs from both sides, and kind of show one of the really powerful things is all of the logs are actually shipped and viewable through the Waypoint UI, which I think is pretty awesome for developers because this now gives them the ease of seeing logs from when they build the application, and shows and streams real logs of when somebody's actually hitting that application, like when it's deployed in Kubernetes. So I'll show you that in a second. So if we flip back over here, we can see that we're actually finally starting. It looks like everything is good to go. I think we're about to start doing the Waypoint stuff is about to start. So we'll let that kick off. Oh, okay, cool. There he has. So what we've done is we've done a Docker login, right? Just to log into the GitLab registry, so that way we can push the image. And now we've done a Waypoint init to initially set everything up. It's going to validate the server credentials. It's going to validate the configuration file, all that sort of stuff. Once it's done, we can now do a Waypoint build where this is going to start building our application for us using the build packs that we specified. And that's where it's at right now. So what I'll do is I'll flip over to the Waypoint UI, and I'll show that we can actually stream these logs from Waypoint as well. So I'll click over here. That's the project. I click the application. And what we can see now is that in our latest builds, we can see that it started 1 minute ago. We can actually see the logs that are streaming here, and they should be pretty close to what we're seeing over here in the GitLab in the job screen. So we can see that the image is built. It's now tagging the Docker image, and once it's tagged, we can now it's going to push it to our registry for us. And if we flip back over here, we should see shortly in our deployments that a new deployment is gonna come up. Right, so we now see a Waypoint deploy. It's connected to our Kubernetes cluster. It's now creating the deployment for us in Kubernetes. And now it's running the deployment, which is going to spin up our pod in Kubernetes for us for our application. And if we flip back over to our deployments here, we can now see that we see a new version. C is deployed by Kubernetes started less than 20 seconds ago. So in the UI, what's pretty, again, powerful about this too is, like I said, I can see all the latest builds, deployments, and releases, but I can also get to the application pretty quickly right here just by clicking this, which I'll do in a second. I think what they've done a really good job with the UI is that it's very minimal right now, and the tool is going to grow a lot for sure. But they've done a good job right away of kind of splitting everything up in that whole concept of the build, deploy, and release. So everything looks deployed successfully, and it was released. And one of the things I want to highlight here that I think is pretty cool is that we get the concept of this right at the bottom, right? We get the concept of our release URL and our deployment URL. And And the concept is that this deployment URL is kind of just meant, right, for the developers to kind of say, hey, here's version, well, in this case, version 7 or application. Here's the URL to go access it. And I've opened it up in the terminal, or sorry, in my UI. And what's happened is now when I get to it, I can see that the application is up, and I realize I actually set this to the black background first when I meant to do white. But that's okay. We can switch it. So this doesn't look the best right now. But the concept here is that the release URL is actually released here as well. So I can open this up, and then this is the endpoint that everybody would see, that my actual end client would see, right? So let's go ahead and fix this now and actually get a white background. So I can come back over here to repository, source, templates, and that's just me not knowing color codes. So there should be FFF. So fixing background. I want to do this anyway, so that actually, I guess, works out better in a way. So commit, and now this should fire off a new pipeline. Great, so we're gonna go ahead and get started now. And while that kicks off again, let me flip back over to our other job. And what I'll do is I'll actually show some of the Kubernetes pieces as well through like kubectl. So yeah, like I was saying, what we get at the end is we get our release URL and this deployment URL. I think this deployment URL is actually super useful because it's able to basically allow me to hit an application at a certain point in time, right? I could easily go ahead and view version 6, 5, 4, or any previous ones, right, by just updating that URL endpoint. I would do it, but I don't want to spoil it changing to a white background right now. So I'll wait for the new version, to come up. So what we'll do is I'll go back over to pipelines. I'll click on this and wait for it to get started. So like I said, what I'll show is, let me go over to the Kubernetes cluster. If I do kubectl node, just want to make sure that I'm still connected. Okay, cool. All right, so what we can do is, what I can show you is if I do a kubectl, we can actually see all the deployments that are existing, right? We can see the recent one that we just did right now. And then what we can check is the actual service as well, so that we can see that we're hitting that public IP address. So we can see our external IP is 103.140, which actually lines up with what we have here. So that URL is always going to be static, and really it would likely just be like a domain name that we would have that's mapping to this IP address. But the idea is with those two URLs is that this one is more for internal kind of testing and making sure the versions are what we want, whereas this one would be the end URL that our clients would actually be accessing. So flipping back over quickly, we can see that we're still building the new version of the application. And I found the build, like I said, the build takes the longest part. The actual deployment is really, really fast. So we flip back over, we can actually see that in the Waypoint UI, we started our new build number 8. And once that's done, we should then see our actual deployment updated. So I'll wait for that to finish. You can see that it's now just at the tagging piece, so it shouldn't be too much longer after that. What I'll do is I'll delete, I can close that. And then once this is built and released, I can go ahead and refresh this, and we should see that white background that we're looking for, which will make the application look a lot better. Okay, it's pushed. We can now do a waypoint deploy. So it's now going to roll out that new deployment for us. Like I said, this usually takes about like 30 seconds. It's pretty fast. It's a small application. Okay, it was rolled out, successful. So we can see that we get the release URL is actually the same URL, but now that we get a deployment URL is a version 8, right? So it's increased by 1. So now if I refresh this with any luck, I now see the white background, which looks good. And now I can see that the application is working as I expected. So the last thing I'll show too, right, is if I open this in a new tab, I see version 8. And then if we want to go see version 7, we can go ahead and do that and see that's what happens when we get version 7. But our end users would actually be seeing this endpoint right here, which has the most up-to-date version. So that's it for the demo. Thank you so much for listening in. And I hope you learned something new about Waypoint and GitLab CI. I'll be hanging around in the YouTube chat after this too, if anyone has any additional questions, or if there's time for questions right now. I think we only have about a minute left.
No worries. I think the only question we had come in was whether we can use Waypoint to deploy to AKS instances. I'm currently going through the documentation to see, but if you happen to have an answer handy.
Yeah, you could, because you would be able to for sure. It doesn't really matter if it's like AKS, GKE, or really any of the managed ones, or it doesn't really matter because it's looking just for like the actual, how I have it set up in GitLab is I have it just the actual endpoint in there, like the API endpoint. And as long as I have a service account for it as well, we should be able to deploy like into AKS or really any Kubernetes flavor.
Perfect. Yeah, that was my suspicion, but I was like, oh, but there's specific examples for GCP and AWS, so I should probably check before I get the answer.
Yeah, I think right now in the learn, I think there was, it's just GKE and AWS, right?
Yeah,
I can't remember.
And if you wanted to do it through Kind as well.
Oh, right.
And I know
yes,
I was doing it with something else too before, but that was a few months ago. So
yeah, yeah, cool.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's all we've got for now. And thank you so much, as always,
Great.
for being a wonderful ambassador, for coming on and giving fantastic talks. Like, it's always a joy to see what kind of content you put together. I love it. So
no, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, Jackie. I'll talk to you later.
Sounds good. Thank you for joining.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.